politically, the liberal side is viewed as liberalism is viewed as, creativity, definitely. What was the other big one I said? Open-mindedness, right? And those are both good, right? There's also some downsides, just like the conservative side has its pros and cons, right? So it's viewed as the side that desires expansion and freedom, right? And acceptance of that. So open-mindedness, acceptance, creativity. But then it's also viewed as the side that is unconscious. And I had a couple other important points to make. Low in order, chaotic. It is seen as chaos. When chaos is taken as a word, right, which is a word that Jordan uses to describe liberalism, and I like it. I think it's very accurate. The other word that's used is the feminine, the power of the feminine, right? Because the power of the feminine is also associated with nature, and nature is low in order and high in chaos. I mean, you see that anywhere. When something starts growing, it grows like crazy unless you contain it. So that's the same idea with liberalism. Is liberalism is boom. It's mass expansion to some degree. As much freedom in any way, in every possible direction, in every as much creativity, all of that type of stuff, right? And another big word was low in responsibility, right? Versus the other side, right? Conservatism, which is more order and low open-mindedness, low creativity, very organized, very rule following, and all those other things. So, they have their pros and cons. I think the biggest would be the consciousness aspect, because the conservative side seems, and I don't really want to talk about conservatism too much here, but that seems to be the side that's more contemplative because of their concern to break order. So they're more contemplative, and thus they're more conscious, as opposed to liberalism, which is less conscious. Not to say they're completely unconscious. They're just, when compared to their other half, they fall lower on that scale.
And I've heard it described that both conservatives and liberals are liberal, like classical liberals, in the sense that a classical liberal was concerned with kind of upholding basic freedoms.
Mm-hmm.
But that when we speak of liberal today, we're most often speaking of kind of progressive liberalism, which doesn't just want basic freedoms, but then wants to kind of, like you were saying, expand in this way. And there's a sense of progression, which also is really interesting, because when you introduce this sense of progress, you're progressing towards something.
Right.
And then you're kind of using the state to get to a particular end, which then also can sometimes infringe on people's freedom. And so it can kind of, I think in that way, whereas conservatism also, I think, is trying to protect those freedoms in a certain way, but is moving more slowly and is not.
Right.
Yeah.
Or not even more slowly, but not at all, or in the opposite direction. It's
more stagnant.
I like the idea that, well, they're both needed in a democracy. They're both needed. One works for the other, right? One forces the conservative to be more creative, and the other forces the liberal to have some restraint, right? It's a checks and balance, or a check and balance. Yeah. But ultimately, it's like one. If it existed on its own, it would be too much order, too much restriction, too much limitation, most likely. And then again, then there's the other side, where if there's only liberalism, it might occur where there's nothing but expansion, and expansion, well, it has a fault. You can only expand so much before you've out-resourced yourself and spread your everything, that so thin that you can't contain it any longer. And I mean, that could be used in regards to anything, land, population, your culture, whatever. But so it's important to understand that what is encompassed in each word, and that there is a distinction between the two, because to be a liberal politically doesn't mean, to some degree it does mean, but it is not only someone who embraces the liberal arts and wants this betterment of life. To be a liberal politically is to have is to there's other aspects of it you can't leave out. Political liberalism isn't the same as liberal arts. And what word would you use to describe that?
Yeah, I would say, honestly, I would say that they have pretty much nothing in common except for that etymological connection. And so
Hmm.
therefore the fact that they both in some way have to do with freedom. But the
Right,
liberal arts, I mean, really anyone can partake of this conversation. And everyone will hopefully be partaking in that conversation because they both desire greater freedom just as an
right.
individual, right? And so insofar as just that
Politics doesn't even matter. It's thrown out the window.
really,
It's
I mean,
not.
well,
Yeah.
we talk about politics, but
Right.
it's not as if you're, you like, oh, I'm a liberal because I said the liberal. There's no like direct connection. The political
Right.
questions are asked, but there's no political tendency of the liberal arts inherently, right?
And that's an important
Yeah.
distinction right there, worth noting, is to embrace the idea of the liberal arts and of liberalism is in that sense is something that both parties of politics do in a democracy. That's an idea that is either embraced or not embraced by some proportion of people on both sides. You know, the conservative, the right side, the Republican side also embraces that to some degree. Obviously, that depends on culture changes, but
Yeah, and I
yeah,
mean, arguably, the kind of colleges who are studying the more traditional, studying the arts in the more traditional way, right? More in,
is
the
more
way that
conservative. Yeah,
is much more like they would be seen as politically more conservative,
right.
right? And there are definitely, different ways of studying the liberal arts, but it really, it comes down to, okay, there's also this connection with freedom. But yeah, but I think to want to study the liberal arts is to be human, I think.
Right. I think that's true. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, because to be virtuous and to seek good, the ultimate perfect good is to be human
Yeah.
if you're doing it right. Um, which there's lots of reasons to stray from that path. But um, when people think of the liberal arts, I think a lot of times they think of like the Renaissance.
Mhm,
Did I say that right?
mhm.
Right, and like art and music, and I mean those are all parts of it. You mentioned
Yep.
you mentioned all that in the beginning. Um, but where was I going with this? Of course, I forgot. It's important to realize that it they both do share that creative side.
Mhm.
They both do have that freedom of embracing something. Like seeking greater freedom in some area,
Yeah.
right? But they are very very separate. There's definitely some. Yeah, I mean, like you said, like they might even be so separate that they're not even touching. Like they're completely
Yeah.
different planets.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting that you are like brought up the Renaissance too and all of that great art because I think that culturally, I mean, we live in a very hyper productive society, right? Where we feel like
Hmm.
we have to make every single minute count towards something that's very practical, right? We can't rest, we can't. And there's this idea of leisure that we've really lost. We think of leisure as, lazing around on the beach, um, which is really not at all what for, centuries people have understood it to be. And so,
Well, and leisure probably for centuries was like the study of liberal arts. Like
yeah,
if you
exactly.
had
So
downtime, you were you
yeah,
were
yeah.
thinking and
And I
developing
mean,
yourself.
yeah, and I mean, for Plato, the study of the liberal arts was wandering around and or not Plato, Socrates, right? I don't know what Plato did, but he wrote dialogues. He wrote the dialogues in which people were wandering around. But for Socrates, the liberal arts were talking to people, like just having conversations and trying to find the truth and having
Yeah,
more conversations, right? Like it wasn't this super systematic process, but it was. I mean, why was Socrates doing that? Because in some way that is good for its own sake. And so
right.
these other meaningful activities, right? Like making art, yeah, beholding beauty, beholding beauty, creating beauty, seeking the truth, writing, creating, like all of these other, we do those things because they're good. We kind of intuitively can tell, okay, this is something that's good in itself. And that making that space and that, opportunity for those good activities to take place can seem like a huge sacrifice, because it's like, oh, I could be doing so many other things with my time right now. Why am I, sitting in the middle of Central Park, just, looking at, I don't know what's around me and really thinking about it and
Right.
really, engaging and
And that's
reflecting
engaging
on.
in the liberal arts.
Yeah, to it, that I would say that's engaging in a meaningful activity, but in
Right.
some sense, yeah, that is this kind of that contemplation of beauty would very much directly connect with this similar, seeking of the truth and this contemplation of what is. So
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And you mentioned something earlier that was ironic, because whether you confuse these two forms of liberalism or not, it's interesting how you pointed out earlier that typically it's the conservative side that tends to be very embracing of the liberal arts, and that ties back to one of the points earlier, how the conservative side tends to be more conscious, and that is what the liberal arts do. They, like you talked about, that's the liberal arts are, and consciousness is the study, and the desire to educate yourself on what you do and don't know and understand it, to gain wisdom on what you don't know and what you do know, and to be able to understand it and why it happens in that, to really articulate it, and that's that's consciousness ultimately, which is virtue also. um, the pursuit of consciousness is virtue, arguably. And so it's funny because that ties right into the conservative side there, which is the opposite of the other definition, the political side of liberalism.
yeah,
So it's all big, a big, you know, drama and ironic, playwright of human life. Ultimately, it's a joke on itself, basically. It's very funny.
yeah, there is,
But
and I think this whole conversation really showcases the importance of, and I mean, honestly, this is something that the liberal arts, really has helped me to learn how to do, better, more than I might instinctively do so. But the importance of learning how to make distinctions, especially based on terms, right? So like,
hmm
I can't tell you how many times in class someone will say, I completely disagree with you. I think that doesn't make any sense, in a very kind way, right? Within the bounds
right.
of the classroom. But we're having these Socratic discussions, and someone will say, well, I disagree with you because I think, this opposite position. And then oftentimes I'll ask them, what did you mean by that term? And through the course of kind of learning, oh, that's what you meant. Well, this is what I meant by that term.
hmm
We begin to realize sometimes that we agree, but that we
Yeah.
use the terms differently.
But we
And
were
so,
we were simply portraying what we know
yeah,
in the only way we know it.
yep. And so by
Or
that
yeah.
conversation, yeah, is
Yeah.
huge.
So, and like we already mentioned, the liberal arts are something that politically liberals study too.
Mhm.
Um,
Oh yeah,
but it is important to know that there is a distinction. Um,
yeah.
you know, but it's also important to know that there's a similarity, politically, um, and my experiences with the United States, because that's where I live. Politically, uh, the left and the liberal side of politics in the United States, they are very open-minded. They are very creative, and they really push people to embrace life, and oh, you want to be an artist, be an artist. Yes, everybody do what you love, and all that type of stuff. And that is, in some areas, definitely a peep at, um, you know the embrace of the liberal arts. But it's still different because politically there are some big words that can really wrap up what liberalism means politically. And while some of them do overlap and are fundamentally shared with the liberal arts, they also have their extreme differences, in words such as unconscious, which goes against which it's the antagonist of the liberal arts to be unconscious, and a low responsibility, and what are the other ones I had? Low order, high chaos, high embrace of like mentioned earlier, that what is associated with feminine energy in many cultures. So it's important to make that distinction and to understand that, because again, everything's a balance in nature and in the world, uniquely enough and beautifully enough. So there's always pros, but there's always cons. And so to think that, and most people err in this area, to think that what you're part of is only good is kind of silly, because there's always going to be a shortcoming. Just like to pursue the liberal arts is good. It is very good. It's virtuous. But the downside to that might be, if you over pursue it, you might neglect things in your life.
And
So,
and I mean, quite literally, if I was to only study the liberal arts and I was to have no means to provide for my life whatsoever, right? And this is more complicated than this, but I would just die, right? You
Yeah.
need the servile arts to
Right.
be able to survive. And I mean, it's more complicated, right? In college, I'm working, there's, like, I'm not talking that literally, but the servile arts and the liberal arts are also in some sense defined by one another, right? And so
Yeah.
if you don't
Like
have,
most things are, there's your
yeah.
balance.
So there's that integration.
Yep.
Absolutely.
And so, did you have any final thoughts before we wrap this up that you want to add?
I mean, I guess if anyone listening is thinking about, studying the liberal arts in any capacity, I say go for it. I don't think you're ever going to regret it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that would be my contribution. I think that they're wonderful.
Yeah.
So.
And there's so many different ways to do that, which is the cool thing, because a lot of people, you use the word studying, and I know you didn't like using that originally, and like that is a deterring word for some people. And so it's like, well, but that means a lot of things. It's like, that's why a lot of people go to school to learn art, even though there's also a whole group of people who are like, why would you do that? Like, you're never going to get a career in art. It's like, that's, inherently that's good to pursue your interest in that area of the liberal arts, right? And where maybe it's not so. The point I'm making is, the liberal arts are so broad that there's almost no way you could not practice and embrace and educate yourself somehow in them. So it's like, don't be deterred from that idea by words. And on a final note, the theme we want to push here is to understand there is a distinction, right? It's important to know that both in a democracy like in the United States, both liberalism and conservatism are necessary. And so there's, of course, being liberal isn't bad, right? But it also means you have to know what comes with what you are believing. There's always going to be, if not something bad associated with it, there's always going to be the potential for the fall in everything in life. And so you have to know that whatever you're doing, there's the pros, which is why you believe in it. You're like, this is the good cause, and it's a good cause because of this. The open-mindedness of liberalism is great, and I would definitely second that. But you have to be aware that there's always downsides. Being too open-minded is dangerous, and being so open-minded that you don't pay attention to anything is also very dangerous, because that's a lot of times what happens when you get so excited on open-mindedness. You completely forget to look at what's around you, because all you see is what's around you, and you're not really, humans can't, we're limited. We can't actually focus on everything at once. So if we're focusing on everything at once, we're probably missing everything at once. So, but it's important to know that there is that distinction between the liberal arts and liberalism. So with that, that's all. Sophia, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
To everybody who watched, I really hope you got something out of this, and be sure to catch our next video, because you'll get something out of that too. Peace.